What began in June 2024 as a space to amplify autistic and neurodivergent voices has grown into something far bigger. A platform for raw, honest conversations about neurodivergence, disability, burnout, inclusion, mental health, and how our identities shape the way we move through the world. From the start, our mission has been clear: to go beyond the headlines, beyond stereotypes, and explore the real lived experiences that often go unheard. Over the past year, we've spoken with parents, professionals, educators, advocates, and everyday people, all united by a commitment to building a more inclusive and accessible world. But what's mattered most is the community. Those of you who listen, share, and remind us, finally, someone gets it. Thank you for being here. This is just the beginning.
Looking for authentic conversations that go beneath the surface? Tune in now to the Deep Dive podcast. Visit us at www.deepdiveau.net. That's deepdiveau.net. And follow us across your favorite platforms: YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and Facebook. Just search at the Deep Dive AU. Join us as we dive deep into stories of neurodivergence, lived experience, and creating a more inclusive world. The Deep Dive podcast. Conversations that matter. Stories that connect.
This is the Deep Dive podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
With over 30 years' experience in occupational health and safety and management, Catherine Lee established the Neurodiverse Safe Work Initiative, which has in its mission to raise awareness and educate employers about the strategic benefits and risks of neurodiversity in employment. Catherine's pioneering work in this space has attracted international attention and led to speaking and consulting engagements in New Zealand, South Africa, the USA, Canada, and Kenya, and being recognised as a finalist in the 2024 MBRIT Awards for improving workplace inclusion and safety for neurodivergent workers. Catherine Lee, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, so how does recognising neurodiversity as a natural variation in human neurology alter the way we think about workplace safety and workplace management?
Oh, for me, it changes everything. And I remember the moment when I first started to understand what neurodiversity was, and it was like the scales fell from my eyes, and all of a sudden I saw my work in occupational health and safety differently, because when we recognize neurodiversity as a natural variation in human functioning, not a deficit or a disorder, just part of the normal spectrum of human brains, we stop treating it as something an individual has to manage on their own. It becomes something the organization must design in and plan for. And that's exactly what our work health and safety laws already expect. The duty of care isn't only to workers who disclose something or who have a diagnosis. The duty of care applies to all workers. So if 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent and 65% of those are of working age, we anticipate that there will be neurodivergent people in every workplace, whether they know it or not. And so they perceive risk differently and respond to sensory stimuli differently. And that's a foreseeable risk. And if it's foreseeable, it's manageable. So instead of saying, if a neurodivergent worker appears to be not complying, instead of saying this worker isn't following our system, we have to start asking, does our system actually work for the way this person's brain works? So that's where safety improvement really starts.
Okay, so in what ways might standard OHS systems fail to account for the different ways neurodivergent employees perceive risks, process information, regulate emotions and attention?
I'm an accredited workplace health and safety management systems auditor. So I've audited many different organization systems, small and large, in all different industries. And what I can say with certainty is that most occupational health and safety management systems that I've audited assume that most workers think and function in a fairly similar ways. So they have this imaginary standard worker, good working memory, good impulse control, comfortable with long toolbox talks, happy to absorb written procedures and remember them under stress, able to easily express themselves in writing, or able to easily read policies and procedures and safety instructions, or safe work method statements, or safety data sheets. But that's not how a large portion of the workforce functions. So, for example, a worker with ADHD may perceive risk or time differently, and they may be able to focus with great attention to detail on things that interest them, but not at all on things that don't, which gives them the appearance of being inconsistent. An autistic worker, for example, may be brilliant with detail and have specific interests, but be overwhelmed by unpredictable noise or ambiguous instructions, and they may not be able to read nonverbal cues very well. And a dyslexic worker may be exceptionally capable and brilliant, but blocked by text-heavy procedures. So none of these are individual failures. They're design mismatches. So when the controls of an organization, the safety controls of an organization rely on cognitive functions that are not universal, well, they're not reliable controls, and there are gaps in that system. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So why is it insufficient to treat neurodiversity solely as a disability access issue and instead as a strategic safety and inclusion priority?
Look, I would say it's not it's not instead, it's not either or. And there is still place for neurodiversity to be recognised through the disability discrimination system. And I would be the last person to say that neurodiversity is not a disability, because for many people it is. And it does meet the definition of a disability under the Discrimination Act. But my argument is that if employers only deal with neurodivergent workers through the disability discrimination lens by maybe offering reasonable adjustments, it's a highly reactive response, and you're only capturing the tip of the iceberg, because what the research tells us is that most adults who are neurodivergent have never been formally diagnosed. In fact, there was research done back in 2018, global research that showed from the 14 countries studied, and in Australia, it was estimated that only 1 in 10 people with ADHD has been formally diagnosed. So there's another 9 people walking around that have never been diagnosed and don't know that they have an ADHD type brain. So my argument is, if most people have never been formally diagnosed, or they don't identify as disabled, or they're fearful of disclosing their difference to their employer because maybe they've had bad experiences in the past, or they've seen what happens to other people when they've disclosed it, often being walked out the door or performance managed or whatever, then they don't want to disclose it. And so they're struggling under the surface, doing their best to cope and fit in, masking, we're trying to comply, but it takes an emotional toll. And so I argue that if employers assume that 1 in 10 of their workers is neurodivergent, and look, in some industries it's even more than that. So industries like construction or IT or engineering, it can be as high as 50% of the workforce who are neurodivergent, whether they know it or not. So if employers look at their workforce with that assumption in mind, then what we know is the employer has the primary duty of care to ensure the health and safety of all workers. It doesn't rely on them disclosing something that they may not even know about themselves. It means that employers have to identify and assess and control the risks in the workplace, and to prevent foreseeable injury. So that means if employers cast a wider lens over their workforce and view all of our different neurotypes through a work health and safety lens, we're going to have more complete, robust risk management systems. And honestly, when employers frame it that way, it's incredibly freeing, because you don't then need medical paperwork. You don't need the neurodivergent worker to then prove that they need the adjustments on genuine disability grounds. You just do it because it's part of your risk management system. And if you think about it, the First Nations workers don't need to provide documented proof of their heritage before being granted cultural leave. And members of the LGBTQI plus community don't need to prove their sexual orientation to be given leave to care for their same-sex partners. So why do we need to provide medical paperwork to prove our neurodivergence when we may not have that? And asking for that medical paperwork before we make the adjustments to the work in the typical disability discrimination model, that's actually an inherently discriminatory practice if the proof we're looking for hasn't been accessible to the individual.
So what are the business and legal imperatives for integrating neurodiversity into DEI strategies and OHS frameworks?
Look, I think we can put these into three categories. Firstly, legal, then organisational, and performance. Okay, so legally, employers have overlapping duties: discrimination law, reasonable adjustments, work health and safety, and now obviously the psychosocial hazards that are coming to the fore as well. But the safety of workers is always takes precedence. And secondly, then organisationally, neurodivergent workers are a significant portion of the workforce. As I've said, in some industries, it's up to 50%. So you can't innovate or retain talent if you're losing that group of workers and the different skills that they bring to the workforce, if you're losing them to burnout and preventable injuries. And so through a performance lens, cognitive diversity is a competitive advantage. People who are neurodivergent bring incredible strengths and talents to the workplace and see things that others don't see. So if we're eliminating those individuals from the workforce, we're missing out on all of those incredible skills and talents that the employer could benefit from. So this isn't just a compliance issue, it's a smart strategy issue.
Okay, so how might failure to adapt workplaces for neurodivergent employees lead to increased incidents, injuries, and near misses, thereby affecting OH&S outcomes?
Yeah, well, okay, so workplaces don't adapt if they have rigid management systems and processes. Then what happens is the neurodivergent worker comes into the workplace and they start to do this thing that we call masking. So it's very simply explained as trying to function normally. They try and pretend to be normal. They try and fit in. They try and get along with other people. If there's someone that doesn't, for example, easily make small talk, they may be perceived as being rude because they don't come in and say good morning to people. And so they force themselves. They force themselves into situations that they're not comfortable with. A really good example I like to give here isn't about neurodiversity at all. It was actually given to me by one of my students, and I like to use this illustration because it sums it up. If a worker is afraid of heights, say they're a facilities manager or whatever, and they're afraid of heights, terrified, pathologically terrified of going up in heights. If their employer says to them, we had a big storm at the weekend, I need you to get up on the roof with the insurer and the builder to check out the hail damage to the roof, or I'll send you up in a crane. Now that worker's terrified of heights. So it doesn't matter how many safety controls the employer puts in place. He can put a harness on him. He can put, I'm assuming it's a male, that's a terribly sexist thing to do, but he could put a harness on the individual. He could put anchor points on the roof. He could put edge protection around the roof to make sure nobody's going to fall off the roof. But none of those physical controls are going to change the fact that he's terrified of heights. And he can't explain it. He can't prove it. The employer may not understand it because the employer may not have the same pathological fear. And he may not even believe the worker because he can't see it or measure it. So the question I ask then is, would it be reasonable for the employer to send that worker up in the roof knowing that the worker is terrified of heights? And so it's not the fear of falling. It's not the physical barriers they put around to prevent the fall. It's the physical feeling that individual gets when they go up in the roof, when they up at a height, when they feel sick. They've got a stress response. They want to vomit. They can't see. Their vision becomes blurry and they're terrified. And you can't tell someone who's afraid of heights to just look at the horizon or don't look down because they're still terrified. Now, it's the same experience for neurodivergent workers going into an environment where the environment overloads their sensory system. So, for example, they may have already had to navigate their way into work through public transport. They may not like feeling touched or close to other people, and yet they're sitting on a commuter train into the city. They're forcing their way through traffic. They're getting stressed. They can't get there on time. And so before they come into the workplace, they're already in a heightened state of arousal. They're already starting to feel overwhelmed. And then they walk into the workplace and they've got to make nice. They've got to be polite because people expect them to. And then somebody next to them has got a radio going and that's playing music. And then somebody's got the microwave going, heating up their eggs for breakfast, and that's making them feel sick. And the person up the corridor is wearing a really overwhelming fragrance. And this neurodivergent person who is highly sensitive to different sensory perceptions, so sound, vision, smells, noise, they're overwhelmed. And then we expect them to sit down and perform their job productively. And it may only take one thing then for that person to completely melt down because they're overwhelmed, right? So I guess the point is being aware of all of this, masking and trying to fit in takes up cognitive energy that should be used for hazard awareness, decision-making, and focus. But all of that cognitive energy is being drained by this sensory overload. And so things like sensory overload, unclear instructions, or unpredictable workflows, they add, the risk of mistakes and slips and lapses naturally increases. Okay, so none of this is about individual capability. It's about the environment, either enabling safe performance or undermining it. And so I always say that I work mostly with the social model of disability that says that a person's difference is only disabling to the extent their environment disables them. And so under that model, it's the environment that has to adapt to the individual, rather than in the medical model of disability, which assumes that the person's difference is a disorder or a dysfunction or a disability, and they have to be diagnosed and treated and fixed and forced to fit in and function in more socially acceptable ways. And there's no obligation on the community or the workforce or the employer to adapt to suit the individual's needs. And these needs are different from preferences.
So from a disability, equity and inclusion standpoint, how can supporting neurodivergent workers enhance organisational culture, innovation and retention, and how does that work?
Well, when organisations support, and not even just support, but provide a space for neurodivergent workers, when they do that well, there's a flow-on effect. So culture improves because people see the difference is normal, that strengths matter, and that psychological safety is real and not just a buzzword. Innovation improves because neurodivergent workers bring unique pattern recognition, creativity, attention to detail, and problem-solving skills. And retention improves because people aren't burning out or burning the candle at both ends, trying to fit into systems that were never designed for them. And safety improves because a psychologically safe workforce actually speaks up about hazards. And so we hear the voices that were quiet before. So those voices that would never speak up before are now able to speak up confidently and safely about the hazards as they perceive them, where before they may have felt inhibited to do that and frightened because they fear outing themselves as a person with a disability or a person with a neurological difference, and then I guess they fear discrimination and judgment and stigma because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So everything improves when you provide for neurodivergent workers.
Okay, so how does the concept of designing work that is healthy, safe and inclusive for the neurodiverse workforce challenge traditional one-size-fits-all safety training and communication methods?
Yeah, okay, so typically safety training is often given like a one-size-fits-all approach. So, long session, lots of text, lots of talking, written assessments. There may be some, hands-on, try on your safety equipment. Let's show us that you know how to wear your face mask. Let's show us that you know how to wear your hearing protection. But the universal design approach suggests a more inclusive style of, we all learn in different ways. So we don't all learn well in the traditional classroom style with PowerPoints or chalk and talk, as we used to call it in my day, where you get the lesson, you get to ask questions, and you get to do your homework, or you get to demonstrate your practical skills. Some people learn differently. So some people are visual learners. Some people are auditory learners. Some people learn like me. I'm an auditory learner, but I learn best when I'm moving my body. So sitting in a chalk and talk format, I can't sit still. I can't take the information in if I'm trying to pay attention to something that may be a bit dry. I'm much better off listening to something as I walk. Or as I don't know, do the ironing or something. I'm much more likely to learn if I'm moving my body and listening. But some people are visual learners. They need to read, they need to see pictures, they need to see colours, they need to see illustrations, they need demonstrations. So we need to find out the different ways that all workers can provide all of that. And really, so that means breaking information down into bite-sized chunks, using multiple formats. So with technology the way it is today, there's no excuse. We can have training given in the traditional chalk and talk classroom. We can have it done in an audio file. We can have online learning, online courses. There's lots of different ways that we can deliver that information. Give people time to process. So, not everyone takes in the information, retains it, and can use it straight away. Some of us need a little bit of time to process that information in a way that makes sense to us. Before we can churn it out in the written test at the end of the session, or before we can demonstrate our competency with wearing using the equipment or the personal protective equipment. So I think the important thing is also checking for understanding as you go, asking people as you go, not delivering the whole training session and waiting to the end when they do their written test or their competency assessment and then finding out that they haven't understood or they haven't processed. Check in as you go. Am I delivering this? Are you understanding this? We're just going to I'm going to talk about this for 10 minutes, or maybe we'll do a demonstration, and maybe I'll put something up on the screen. But let's talk about this, and then are you understanding? Can you tell me what you've understood? Because I always think, education is just another form of communication. We're imparting skills and knowledge to other people, and I always think that the responsibility for effective communication lies with the communication, the person delivering the message, not the person on the receiving end. So if I, as an educator, am delivering information to an audience that's not understanding me because I'm delivering it in ways that don't come naturally to them for learning, then I need to change the way I deliver the message so they do get it. Right?
So what kinds of adjustments or accommodations should an organisation consider to be proactively inclusive of neurodivergent employees?
Okay, so I'd probably group these again into 3 categories. So there's environment, information, and support, right? So environment, so reduce unnecessary noise, harsh lighting, and sensory clutter. Look at things like flexibility around working days, working hours, whatever. Don't be too rigid about everybody's got to be at work at 9 o'clock, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, because that's what the boss wants. The boss wants to see everybody there that time of day. Why? Does it really make any difference? So thinking about the environment, and then with information, I think making critical safety information, any organizational information actually, making that available in multiple formats. So not just a whole lot of written procedures and policies in a policy manual in the lunchroom in hard copy for people to read. Make it available online. Have text-to-voice software available and voice-to-text software available. If it's available online, have accessibility features turned on so you can change the color, you can change the concentration, you can change the font type so that it is accessible to people whose brains function differently. Maybe using visuals and I think avoiding jargon and offering written and verbal options. So sometimes it's surprisingly rare how rarely you see like an employer's, say, glossary of terms. I've probably only seen it 2 or 3 times in employers, but I always think it's a brilliant idea, because when you're a new worker going into a workplace, you find there's a whole lot of jargon that people talk, acronyms that you come in as a stranger and it sounds like you're talking a foreign language, and it can take ages to understand what all these acronyms mean. So having a ready reference guide, this ADHD means attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So just spelling out what all those acronyms mean can make it so much easier for people and take some of that cognitive load away. And then finally, support. So flexible routines. Buddy systems are a great idea, particularly for when onboarding processes. Coaching is a really powerful workplace medium for development, and I would recommend that for anyone, not just neurodivergent workers, and also trained managers. So I think it's so important to have our frontline managers and managers in specialist roles like work health and safety or injury management or HR, having managers trained in neurodiversity awareness so they understand. We can get rid of some of the stigma and the unconscious bias and create, prepare these people for conversations that they may have that can go well or go badly, depending on how well the manager's prepared for it. So I guess the goal is not to fix the person, because there's nothing wrong with the person, right? It's about removing the systemic barriers that make the environment disabling for that individual.
So how does viewing neurodivergent strengths play into both OH&S performance?
Well, strengths that's where the value is, right? So every human, whether we're neurodivergent or neurotypical, we all have strengths and we all have challenges. And the strength is where the value is. So if we can work with the individual's inherent strengths, so often I see in the disability discrimination framework that's so often applied in workplaces, the focus is on the deficit. The focus is on what the worker can't do, right? And that's where management tends to come down. But focus on the positives. What can they do? So, for example, probably generalizing here, and I'll say mea culpa there up front because this doesn't apply to everyone. But for example, an autistic person may have incredible pattern recognition skills, or they may have a unique talent that the employer can apply, like, maybe they understand, maybe they can, for example, like they may be able to go into a workplace, maybe they're an IT person and they can go in and they can diagnose problems within complex systems. Just, by doing a kind of scan of the area and going, okay, now it's all coming together for me. I can identify where the problems are, where somebody without that ability might need to sit down for days to work it all out. Okay. So people with ADHD, for example, can be incredibly creative and respond really well in crisis situations. Dyslexic people are renowned for being big picture thinkers and entrepreneurial. So if we focus on the strengths that the individual brings and capitalize on those, we're going to be much better off as a workforce. And when we design work to amplify those strengths and obviously support the friction points, then both safety and performance improve. I mean, if you've got someone who's neurodivergent working with you to identify hazards in the workplace, a neurodivergent person is going to spot a hazard that a neurotypical person won't see. Then it would have gone missed, and a missed hazard is an uncontrolled hazard.
What role does leadership and management awareness have in ensuring that neurodiversity is embedded as both an OH&S priority and an inclusive employment practice?
Well, obviously, leadership sets the tone. And I know everyone says that it starts at the top, and it's true. But they also say that a fish rots from the head. So look at the peak body, the top level of management in your organization, and it does start with them. They can get it right. They can lead well. I think a very, very wise leader once said to me Kathy, you can lead well or you can lead badly. But when you're in a leadership position in an organization, you are a leader, whether you lead well or lead badly. And wherever you lead, people will follow. If the organization doesn't understand or value neurodiversity, then no one else below them in the organization will. If they do, if they start at the top and say, we recognize and welcome diversity of thought, and we want to attract all of that wonderful talent to our workforce, but we need to fix our systems to make it safe for people to work with us. And that's the message that's communicated through every level of the organization, but it has to come from the top.
So how might incident investigations, hazard identifications, or safety audits need to be adapted to consider neurodivergent perspectives or cognitive differences?
Yeah, this is a really important topic, Michael, and I'm so glad you brought it up. I have actually, if anyone's interested in jumping onto my website, I actually hosted a panel discussion about this a little while ago. There's tremendous evidence now to show that neurodivergent people are often very badly disadvantaged, both in the criminal justice system, but also in workplace investigations, because often investigators, again, assume neurotypical functioning, right? So they assume that everyone thinks and perceives and responds to risk in the same way, and they don't. We know that. So we need to stop assuming that human error explains everything, and we should ask, for this neurodivergent person, was the environment overwhelming? Was the communication clear? Was the procedure accessible? Did masking or fatigue play a role? For example, I worked with an individual. It's one of the case studies that I talk about in my training. An autistic individual. The employer didn't know that she was autistic. She'd been diagnosed in childhood. She'd functioned very well. She was a payroll supervisor in a healthcare system. Brilliant. Had an encyclopedic knowledge of the very complex pay and awards systems. But when another worker came to work with her, her exacting style and fairly blunt communication was perceived by the other worker as bullying. And it all came to a head when the autistic worker had an autistic meltdown in the workplace. And then the next day when she returned to it, she was very embarrassed and she couldn't talk to the other worker. And so that other worker put a bullying complaint in against her. So when I went to chat to that autistic worker, it all came out that she wanted to explain the way she functions in work is, she said it's, and I didn't tweak to it myself, but she said it's just part of my Aspie nature. Of course, Aspie is how often people with level 1 autism refer to themselves. In the old days, the diagnostic term was Asperger's syndrome, and that's what she had been classified as. She says it's just part of my nature, but other people perceived it as bullying, right? Yeah. So the problem is, if people, when they're interviewing workers with, we'll say, ADHD or autism, investigators often, what's it called? I forget now. Where you assume that certain facial expressions or the way we move our eyes or the way we hold our bodies says something about our intent. So, for example, an investigator might assume that if a person's not making eye contact with them when they're answering the questions, then they're hiding something, then they're not being dishonest. Whereas for an autistic person, sometimes making eye contact can contribute to that sensory overwhelm. What they actually need to do is avert their eyes and look away so they can actually then de-stress and think about the questions that they're being asked so they can give an honest answer. But if they're forced to, if it's assumed that not making eye contact means they're lying, then wrong decisions are going to be made. Likewise, if a person with ADHD is fidgeting in their chair and can't sit still, an investigator might assume that the person is uncomfortable with that line of questioning and they're obviously hiding something. And these are the assumptions that people make. So really, workplace investigators need to be trained as well. They're one of those specialist groups that need to be trained in neurodiversity so they understand that not everyone responds the same way during investigations and interviews for investigations. Richer and more accurate insights.
So what are the risks of overlooking neurodiversity when you consider both disability access, compliance and duty of care in OH&S?
Well, obviously the biggest risk, you end up being non-compliant in two directions. Firstly, disability discrimination and also the work health and safety duty of care. So it's the employer that has the primary duty of care to ensure the health and safety of all workers, so far as reasonably practicable. So if they're not doing that, then they're not discharging their primary duty of care, but they also risk falling afoul of the Disability Discrimination Act if they're, for example, requiring workers to provide proof of their neurodivergence before they consider making adjustments to the work. And so I guess, but more importantly than the compliance issues is that people get hurt, whether it's physically or whether it's psychologically. People are hurt if employers don't understand this and get it right. And I deal with neurodivergent workers every day who've been terribly damaged by their employer's response to their disclosure. And, some, they're not working, or they may never work again, or they may never work in their chosen profession because they've been so badly damaged by their experience. So, most most of that harm is preventable if the employer understands and designs the workplace around their whole workforce and engineers the risk out of the workplace.
So looking ahead, what are the strategic advantages for an organisation that proactively embeds neurodiversity into their disability access frameworks in terms of resilience, innovation and workforce wellbeing?
Yeah, well, organisations that do this well, Michael, have safer systems. And there's plenty of research that shows that neuro-inclusive employers have safer systems, stronger innovation, better retention, far lower psychosocial risks, and better customer, client, and worker engagement. So the thing is, if that care that's extended to neurodivergent workers flows out to others. So if, for example, you're a worker and you're in a customer-facing role, if you've been treated well by your employer and you feel safe and you feel seen and heard and understand as you are, and you don't need to mask, then you can extend that inclusivity to the people you serve, right? And that makes better customer engagement, right? So frankly, it's just good for business, and it's good for communities, it's good for families, it's good for humanity.
So one more question before we end the Deep Dive podcast for today, and we ask this for every other sort of guest here on the podcast. If there's one piece of advice that you'd like to say in 30 seconds or less, what would that be?
I would address it to employers, and I would say, take your blinkers off, get yourself educated, and realize that we are a diverse species. We have diversity of language, ethnicity, gender, culture, sexual orientation, and so too there is diversity of thought. And that's what makes us strong as a species. And so bring it into your workplace and embrace it, and you'll have a much safer, more productive, and more successful business and culture.
On that note, Catherine Lee, thank you so much for being part of the Deep Dive podcast today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
To find out more about the Neurodiverse Safe Work Initiative, go to neurodiversesafework.com.au.